And hello and welcome to the second Traver Award panel discussions with recent winning and honorable mention writers. I'm David Van Wie. I'm a member of the John D. Volker Foundation Board of Directors, and I'm also in my fourth year as the volunteer administrator for the Traver Award. I'm here tonight in tiny Lyme, New Hampshire, and admitting one more person. Just a long double haul from the Connecticut River. On behalf of the Volker Foundation and our partner in the Traver Award, the American Museum of Fly Fishing, I want to thank you all for joining us and for your interest in the award, whether you're a past or future entrant, whether you're a judge, a supporter of the museum or the foundation, or simply a reader of great fishing stories. I'll introduce our panel in a moment, but first I want to recognize a couple people on the virtual podium, some of whom I've already been speaking to. Richard Van Der Veen is in Marquette, Michigan. He's the longtime president of the Volker Foundation and one of the founders of the original Traver Award. We also have Sarah Wilcox and Kate Acor from the American Museum of Fly Fishing. Kate is the editor of the American Fly Fisher Journal of the Museum, which publishes it's a quarterly that publishes the winner, and Sarah Wilcox is the art director, correct? I think that's right, yes. The Volker Foundation raises funds for the prize money, and the museum has been publishing the winners and honorable mention stories for the past 3 years online, and the winners in the journal, and provide a home for the award as part of fly fishing history, which we're very pleased to have them after a hiatus when, unfortunately, Fly Rod and Reel magazine closed down. Tonight, we have a panel of talented writers who will each talk for a few minutes about their writing and their stories and how they managed, hold on, I'm admitting some more people in the waiting room, and how they managed to win over our judges. We'll give them each a few minutes to speak, and then I may ask a question or two of follow-up, and then we'll open it up for question and answers at the end. We should go about an hour with the main comments, and then we should have at least another half an hour for Q&A for those who want to stay for that. I'd like to keep this pretty informal. I have the panelists pinned on your screen, so they should always be on the front. If you scroll around to see people on the other screen, the panelists should stay there. Please keep yourself muted during the talk, and unless you raise your hand and we call on you to speak. Hold on, letting one more in to the from the waiting room. We also have the chat function working, so you can enter questions in the chat function, or for everyone, or if you want to talk to some people individually, you can do that. Just ask you to keep it polite, please. So what we won't be doing tonight is giving you a formula for how to win the award. We aren't going to tell you what the judges are looking for, because that's impossible. They aren't looking for anything in particular, not a specific style or type of story. We've seen both fiction and nonfiction honored in recent years, and we would love to see more great fiction, by the way. But what we hope to see is excellent writing that involves fly fishing and addresses the criteria as stated in the contest rules. The stories that win or make it to be finalists will be well crafted and carefully edited. The judges will be looking at how you create scenes, characters, dialogue, mood, voice, humor, conflict, transformation, purpose, pacing, language, emotion, something rich, something multifaceted, perhaps unexpected, something only you can write, which really is the formula for any great writing. So that is not meant to be particularly helpful. It's meant to just mean that we're looking at all dimensions of the stories. Let me just take a moment to describe how we do the judging. First of all the judging is anonymous. We rename the files when they're submitted with a random number and create a key that we don't look at until we get to the very end. And we judge in 3 rounds. In the first rounds, the stories are grouped randomly and assigned to 5 discerning readers who score their group of stories. We look at the total scores across all the groups to decide how many to advance to the second round. The first round usually cuts the pool down to about 20% of the original total, sort of the 80-20 rule. In round 2, a new panel of 4 or 5 judges reads and scores all the stories with general criteria relating to the contest criteria, content, craft, originality, style, mechanics, etc., with plenty of room for their personal preferences and judgment. Based on the total scores in the second round, we typically move 8 to 12 stories on to be finalists. Those finalists go to our final 4 judges, 2 from appointed by the Volcker Foundation and 2 appointed by the museum. And they apply their own criteria and preferences. There are no rules for the final judging other than reaching a consensus. They discuss them, they usually rank them individually, then discuss them again, and ultimately choose a winner in any that they feel should have honorable mention, although that's not required. So to win this contest, a story needs to impress 5 readers in the first round, plus 4 or 5 in the second round, plus 4 in the final judging, or 14 different people need to give your story the thumbs up to make it to be a winner. So we're going to go to our panelists now and ask them how they did it. Let me introduce the folks who are with us tonight. Alex Benoît won the Traver Award in 2020 with Blue Lines, a personal essay about maps and memory and grandparents. He's a high school teacher at Greenfield School in Wilson, North Carolina, where he teaches English, journalism, and creative writing. Paige Wallace was honorable mention last year with Pretending to Listen, a personal story about a fly fisher and a non-fly fishing spouse. She was a finalist in 2019 with an earlier version of the same story, Learning to Mend. Paige is a freelance writer and content creator who enjoys telling true stories about people, fish, and the places where those lives intersect. When she's not on a lake or river with a fly rod in her hand, you'll find her training her pandemic puppy, taking photos, or swing dancing in her hometown of Portland, Oregon. Michael Doherty is a neurologist living in Seattle, Washington. He's a 2-time recipient of the Robert Traver Award with Shining Path in 2008, which is in the Traver Award anthology, Love Story of the Trout. And his other story is 7 Great Flies for the Boston metropolitan area, a very funny story about a courting fly fishing couple. Both the winners were published in Fly Rod and Reel magazine. He also earned honorable mention in 2019 with Les Poissons Toxiques. Dr. Doherty mainly treats people with seizures, and when he's not doing that, he's out fishing with his son or thinking about how to write a fishing story that isn't exactly about fishing. David Gray-Clough won honorable mention in 2020 with his story, The Best Fish I Ever Caught, which is about, well, you can probably guess that one. David lives in the beautiful Yorkshire Dales in the north of England, an area famous for high quality fly fishing in its many rivers. He's been shortlisted finalist 3 times in 4 years for the prestigious Wexford International Short Story Competition. He currently has 2 books in print and on Amazon, Yorkie Boys and Yorkie Boys and Girls, amusing tales of growing up in the 1950s and 60s. Hold on, I gotta check my waiting room again. I think I'm all set. Hold on. He's got a book of fishing adventures that's going to be published later this year. And Mike Chalmers earned honorable mention last year with Solitude, a story about a prisoner on death row who dreams of fly fishing. Mike is a writer in the communications and marketing office at the University of Delaware. Before that, he worked as a newspaper reporter for 25 years. His writing experience is almost entirely in nonfiction, so he was eager to try fiction for the Traver Award. His short story, Solitude, earned an honorable mention last year. We also have with us tonight as a guest, Michael Thane, who is a retired physician from the Boston area, who earned honorable mention in 2020 with Grace Note. And we'll invite him to speak up on any of the stories if he wishes tonight. So that is our panel. And I'm going to go, I guess, kind of in order of how I introduced them, and start with Alex. And my first question is really the same question for everyone, which is, what can you tell us about your Traver Award story and how did it come together?
Sure. So it's how it came together, I guess, is both rather simple and complicated. I took this trip to Alaska after I graduated college with my dad and a couple family members, and knew I wanted to write about it, but struggled for really a year and a half trying to figure out how I was going to tell that story. And in reading Michael Doherty's piece, Le Poisson Toxique, I'm probably butchering the French pronunciation, bit of embarrassment since I have a French last name, but I decided it needed to be a story that's not really just about fly fishing. For me in general, that's how my writing works, is that if I try to write just about fishing, it comes out in a way different than what I want, and not clear, or maybe a little bit too cliched. So the way that I ended up framing it was having conversations with my grandfather when I was younger about his trip to Alaska after he retired from being a carpenter for 60 years, and putting those two sort of journeys in conversation with each other. So that's the short of it, the short way that I came to write that piece in the first place. But it went through a ton of drafts. I give a lot of credit to a mentor that I had in graduate school, Carlo Ritella. A lot of the stuff I learned about writing, I learned from him. And he was, just taught me not everything I knew about writing, but, nearly everything I knew.
Great. Yeah, so there's several different layers to it. Including not just maps as memoir, but you have sort of kind of a broader rumination on how we remember things and how we tell stories, and how your stories compared to your grandfather's. Can you tell us kind of how those layers came in? Did they come in some order? Did you suddenly go, oh, wow, wait a minute, this is really about X? Or did you just find yourself on a little, as my wife calls it, a little walkabout, and as you're writing, and then realize, wait a minute, that's actually the best part of the story?
It's probably the latter of those. It was really the story and then the map making aspects that functioned independently for a while. I remember actually the moment where I was thinking about writing it, and then I had I wouldn't say the light bulb, but more of like the smack in the face, where it's like, how did you not think of this a year and a half ago? Where I had been making maps and like pocket notebooks and stuff. I carry them around with me every day. They're mostly for to-do lists and things, but for like fishing in particular, I find it onerous to sort of pull that out and take notes in the moment. So what I'll often do is, after a fishing trip or after a particularly eventful or maybe uneventful day of fishing, draw a very rough, amateurish map of where I was fishing. Because at least from my perspective, it's not about remembering the day and the event and the experience perfectly, but it's remembering it imperfectly that actually leads to, I think, the most beautiful way of telling that story. And I think for that reason, maps are a really interesting way of telling a story, sharing a narrative, and one that I hadn't seen a lot of. And so marrying the ideas of making maps about places that I had been to, which is something I'd done since I was 4 or 5 years old. I've never been much of an artist, ever have been. And I don't think I have the talent to, keep on going with that, as you can see if you take a look at those drawings. But it's something that helps me remember places, but also communicate those events and meaningful experiences to me, to other people, particularly to my grandfather.
Yeah. Well, I know that's what the judges found refreshing, was that the take of the maps and the way you said things are not to scale. I think they found that to be something, as you said, that's pretty unusual. We see a lot of stories that are very similar, and this was one that stood out because it was very different from many we'd seen for a while. Cool. All right, Paige. So can you tell us a little bit? Yours is interesting because, of course, you did exactly what I recommended to many of our entrants, which is take another whack at your story and see if you can raise it up a few levels. And you did it, and it worked. So I love that. So can you tell us a little bit about how that process worked and sort of what went through your mind as you did it? Both stories are excellent, by the way, but they have very different flavors. One is sort of lemon, the other's lime. It's not quite the same.
This story itself started as a social media post for our anniversary, just kind of appreciating my husband, who is very different from me, but we have this really great relationship. And that original version was very, very different than even the two that I submitted. And, I think getting a little bit of recognition for it on that initial pass when I submitted it, that combined with, I signed up for a writing class. There's a little institute here in Portland that does, they had a creative nonfiction class. And so I wrote some fresh pieces for that, but I also thought this one really deserved just to go back and look at it and see if I could restructure it. And I tried to look at, I thought the wedding vow was a really interesting piece of the story because I don't know if you've all read it, but my husband promised to pretend to listen when I talk about fly fishing because he doesn't fish. And I thought that was a really clever way of saying, I will pay attention to what matters to you. But it was also funny. It made everyone at the wedding laugh. And so I toyed around with, what if I start with that and use that as a device to draw people in? Also, I think when it's unusual to have a female narrator in that position. And often it's the guy in the relationship who doesn't fish, or who fishes, and then the woman that doesn't. So I really like that this sort of turned everything on its head. And I used that as a device to get into how our relationship developed and how, one of the things I've always been really interested in when I write about fly fishing is there's all these terms that I think are unique because they have multiple meanings, and mending was one that I thought I could play off of because it's this thing we do when we're fishing. But for many of us, fishing is a way to mend these holes in our lives. And so I wanted to write about that. And, reading the water is another one that I think is a really interesting term that maybe someone here will write about it. I think it's got lots of meanings. But yeah, I'm a fan of revisions. Like even when I read this story or other things I've written, if I go back to it after a month or many months, I will see things that I might do differently. And I love playing with structures, playing with the words, playing with how do I tell this story. And I think it's Mike, who is the other person who comes from a journalism and marketing background. And with that, with that kind of writing, you're always looking for what is the kind of tidbit that, especially in marketing, how are you going to draw people in? What is most interesting? Can I start with that? And with journalism, it's, what's the most important piece of the story? And I still do journalism. I like to write feature stories because I like telling stories, and those are fun for me. So yeah, I was looking for that. Like, what is the little interesting tidbit I can start with? And one thing I also do is I think a lot of writers say, oh, I don't have any idea where I'm going when I start writing. And I'm kind of the opposite of that. I always sort of I'm looking for the thing that, like, something I can touch on that maybe I can tie back in later. And create meaning by using that thing or that conversation or whatever the element is that I can weave back into the story. So yeah, that's kind of how I came about this piece. And yeah, I'm glad I revised it. I feel very honored to be among this group of writers. It's pretty impressive. So
you did a fabulous job with it. Yeah, it was interesting. The first one, the Learning to Mend, you played on that a lot more, and it seemed to be more about that aspect, whereas Pretending to Listen seemed to be more about the relationship and the marriage rather than the past. And I think that changed the flavor a bit. Again, not that made it a better story, but I just think your revision brightened the whole thing up. And it's also testament to revision as a creative process. Mm-hmm. that a lot of people dread revision, or they think they shouldn't have to revise, and a lot of other people look at it as it should be fun. That's really where you get to play with stuff. You find pieces, you blow them up, you take them away, you shrink them down. And that's a huge creative process. You find little nuggets that you didn't even notice before.
Yeah, and it changes the story quite a bit. I think sometimes when you get into revisions, you find the pieces that you're going to focus on this time, and it makes for a completely different story.
Right. I'm going to shift to Michael Doherty next, because I just when I read 7 Great Flies for the Boston metropolitan area, I was just laughing and laughing. What a great story. And that is so full of tidbits and twists and turns that couldn't have come in the first pass, that they had to have gotten built in as you read it and reread it and found things and added things and played with things. And so Michael, could you tell us, you've got 3 stories, they're all a little different. Can you tell us a little bit about your process and kind of how your writing has evolved over these 3 entries?
Sure. Well, thanks, David, and thank you for inviting me to participate here. And it's just, as others have said, including last week, it's an honor to be included in this group. I love a lot of the work. I was reading through, just laughing and thinking about the similarities in terms of my life and how other people have put their stories together. Special shout out to Alex Benoît. I love the map thing, just the multimedia aspect to it. And then to Jimmy Watts' beautiful story about how that young man was fishing and passed and so forth. But moving to my work, I've been writing for a long time for fun, and I like to read, and I think that's 9/10 of it right there. Is I like to read, and then I like to try and imitate what I've read. And over time, I've narrowed down my list of authors who I consistently go back to and reread over and over again. And in the purpose of this meeting, trying to figure out why it is I like them. First of all, I'll just mention some of the authors, and you mentioned one last week in terms of the craft of writing. Francine Prose's Reading Like a Writer is an outstanding book on just learning how to use structure, plot, diction, allegory, etc., over and over again. It's just a beautiful work. But I mean, the list for me is fairly long. Toby Wolfe, Tim O'Brien, Jack London, Anthony Doerr, David Foster Wallace, Joseph Heller, David Gooderson, and I would add in women writers too, Elena Ferrante, Lauren Groff, reading broadly and picking up how they use their descriptions of characters and how they advance plot, how they set up jokes, how they impart double meanings into their work, and then going back and doing an exercise on my end of rewriting it from my version and tucking it into somewhat of an artificial background of a fishing story somehow. So that's how I started and how I continue to do it. And it's not plagiarism so much as I liked what they did there. I'm going to try it in my version this way. The second part in my writing, I think, over time that I've found more and more interesting is just straight up careful observations of mediocrity. And I don't mean mediocrity in the terms of a judgmental way, but all of us are facing some things that are getting worse or harder. And if they're described well and with empathy, those mediocrities, in terms of how you place it in a plot where patterns are recognizable, they will directly intersect in terms of conflict. And the conflict, to me, as I get older, ought to be a little bit more sharp and funny and satirical, because there's some things that I'd want to get off my chest. It was, at least, for instance, that last one, The Shining Path, which is probably the easiest ones for readers and listeners on this panel to access. It's really a satire of fishing stories, frankly, of the act of fishing, but tucked within it is a second message of what is actually happening in our world of fishing and climate change, and where are we heading, and what is it that we're prioritizing in our pursuit of fish and our conservation of what it means to fish and to enjoy it. So over time, I think my messages from the stories have become, I think, I don't know if others agree, but a little bit funnier, a little less serious in terms of my personal view, but perhaps more serious in sort of the concern for where we're heading.
Well, I was in the dentist chair this morning having my teeth cleaned, and I'll tell you, every time I go to the dentist, I think of Les Poissons Toxiques. And I told you the other day, Michael, I happen to have a dentist who's a fly fisherman, and every time I go in there, he asks me what I do, and I say I write about fly fishing, and he tells me the same fly fishing story over and over again, not remembering at all that we've had the same conversation 3 or 4 times. So I hope he's not on here tonight. You know, Dr. Werner Knight is alive and well in Hanover, New Hampshire. So yeah, we appreciate the humor, and I'll tell you, humor's hard. It's hard to write good humor. I like to think I can tell a good joke, but I have the hardest time making it come out in writing. So I admire people who can really set you up and then make you laugh out loud, because I don't feel like I have any idea how to do that.
I think the part with humor that's interesting too is you laugh at the punchline, but then later you're thinking about it as to why that was funny. And then that second round of, oh, okay. That often to me is the bigger payoff, is can you get that second round to the humor where people are actually thinking about it more seriously, is why did they tee it up that way? And
yeah,
why was it delivered in this way specifically? Yeah,
very good. So humor is a good segue to David Gray-Clough, because his story, the best fish I ever caught, is got some masterful setups in there as well. And so David, can you tell us a little bit about your story?
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you to the Volker Foundation and to David for inviting me to join such illustrious company. Although it's the middle of the night here in England, I am delighted to be with you and to listen to what everyone has to say. The origin of that story was, I was planning a book on fishing. This one came to mind quickly from childhood experience. My mother was Irish and my father was English. And although we lived in England, we spent every summer with our relatives back in Ireland. And this link with two quite different societies provides the basis of many of my stories. Ireland was wonderful free fishing, in contrast to the very organised, well-policed and often expensive fish in England, which in a way is a metaphor for the difference between the two countries. As kids in England, my brother and I were strictly disciplined, well-behaved, conformist, and in Ireland we were just the opposite, left to run wild with our Irish cousins and friends. We fished anywhere we wanted, we lit fires, we stole cigarettes, we stole booze, we stayed out all night, just wonderful, unforgettable experiences. And sadly, something kids can no longer do. So that in itself is the basis of many, many stories. I think realistic dialogue is really important to a good story. In Ireland, I used to listen to my mother talking with her friends and relatives. And the Irish just have an innate sense of humour and a natural poetry in their conversations, which we English haven't got. For example, my Uncle Jack, when he was hungry, he would announce, "Jesus, I could eat the chin straps off Moses." I have no idea what it meant, but it was just so original and funny that I never forgot it. My mother, when my father returned home from work, he'd fallen asleep in front of the fire. My mother would kick him and said, "Get up, you lazy article." My father would stir, my mother would kick him upright and turn to us kids and say, "Sure, he'd be dead himself if he only had the sense to stiffen." So my advice about writers is to really listen to what people say. I do like humour in a story, and I hope I brought it across in that story about the best fish, preferably self-effacing humour. And I try to make a wider point. Fishing's not just about catching fish or failure to catch fish. Fishing teaches you important lessons in life. And in that story, it taught me an important lesson. When I'm trying to make a news story, I try to get character setting and plot from the start. For example, this is one I've just started because of the pandemic. I'm a complete sucker for those glossy tackle shop adverts in the fishing magazines. I fall for the lot. Magical new fly line, I'll have it. New wonder fly, I'll have it. New rod, must have. During the pandemic, I was personally responsible for keeping several online tackle shops in business. And that, I hope, has set up the plot of the story, which I hope is in a humorous way. Does that help you, David? Where it came from?
Yes, very good. So yes, you caught the. It was very interesting reading. For one, it was very fun to read English as opposed to American English. It was just refreshing when you've got dozens of stories that you're reading, and some of them are on a very different voice. It's just nice to hear it. And your play of the English and the boy and the Irish dialect was, I thought, masterful, and really made the story sing. And I do recall one of our judges, I won't name names, but I think the comment was, he had me at wanging gerbils. So, so yeah. And so can you tell us a little more about that ugly wee Fokker? Everyone, the inquiring minds want to know.
Well, it was a true story. It was based on truth. These two old guys were expert fishermen, and I was just a real know-it-all English kid. And it taught me a lesson. They use huge tackle there in Ireland, and we, as a kid, I thought it was crude and rustic, and they were just country boys. Whereas that is the tackle that's needed there, and giant things like that. I mean, my grandfather used to fish pike fishing with spoons that were a foot long, and catch these huge pike in Loch Earn. He was a famous fisherman. and it taught me a lesson. Local knowledge is far more important than book knowledge.
Yeah, excellent. All right, so I think we're down to Mike Chalmers, and then I'm going to warn Michael Thane that we're going to give him an opportunity to at least ask some questions of his other panelists or comment on their work if he would like, since we had him on the calendar originally. But Mike, you want to tell us a little bit about your story, and I may have a follow-up as well, and then we'll go to questions.
Sure. So like you said in my introduction, my background is pretty much all in journalism and writing for a living, as a communications and very technical writing. And so I had only really heard, to be honest with you, my confession is I really only heard of the Traver Award year and a half or so ago. So I knew I wanted to try something, and I always wanted to try fiction. So I thought this is my chance to write some sort of fictional fly fishing story. And I came up with the idea of this solitude, because, well, at that point I had been, like most of the world, in pandemic lockdown for a year and working from home and sort of stuck in my house pretty much that whole time. And for me, fishing was one of the ways I sort of got out and was able to get out and see the sunshine now and then. And at the same time, had come across this whole series of stories, journalism, about prisoners who had been in prison for years, decades, some of them, and who were then later exonerated because they were innocent. Their DNA evidence had proved them innocent. And I was just fascinated by their stories of how they developed sort of an interior life, and dreams and thoughts, and that sort of helped them maintain some semblance of sanity and some resilience. And so I just tried to imagine, what it would take to have a person who's in prison, who's never seen fly fishing before, discover fly fishing while in prison. And it just became a story about sort of that, using fishing as a way of staying sane and staying connected with the outside world, and staying sort of upright when everything around you has sort of locked you down. In journalism, I've have been in a few prisons. I've never been in prison, but I have been inside prison. So I kind of just use some of that imagination as well to try to paint that picture a little bit. So it was, that's, like I said, my, creative writing, fiction writing certainly is I'm a complete newbie. So that's why I'm enjoying this panel discussion as much as anything, because it's, I get to hear from some people who've really had a lot more experience about that aspect of it.
Yeah. Cool. Well, yeah, it was interesting when I read it because it hit home for me. I actually have been, I visited a maximum security prison a number of times. My brother was in prison for a number of years, and I've written about it in a story called Doug's Rock, which is in the Confluence. Your description, as I think I mentioned before, your description is pretty accurate. You did a good job. I was curious as to, kind of how you must have either found some research or you watched the Shawshank Redemption or something to try to put yourself in those shoes. But, the guard stripping down the cell and taking all the contraband, that happens all the time.
Yeah, there was, when I worked in as a reporter in Altoona, Pennsylvania for a while, I covered a trial. There had been a prison riot at a prison near Huntington, Pennsylvania. And I got a chance to cover the trial. And so I heard a little bit of it that way. And at one point I got to tour the prison. They took me in, and I mean, it is the classic, like if you picture Shawshank Redemption, I mean, it was being in that. It was big, thick, heavy stone walls and iron bars and that sort of thing. So It was right out of, that was a prison right out of the movies. So that was sort of what I had in mind. And it was funny because a friend of mine read the story and said, "Oh, that reminds me of a prison that I've, seen, near where I fish." And David, you had said that it sort of reminded you of the prison that you had experience with as well. So that was gratifying that I had sort of touched that for two different people in two different places. So.
And again, one of the lessons there was it's a very unusual and an unusual story in an unusual setting, but a story very well told. So it really I think stood out in that regard.
Okay.
All right. Well, I think we've gotten all the panelists. I'm a little surprised we did all that in 45 minutes. So I will open it up to questions. I'm going to give some of our insiders maybe a first crack here. I'm going to ask Michael Thane or Rich Van Der Veen or Kate or Sarah if any of you guys have any questions for the panelists, and then I'll open it up to the general participants here. Anybody else have a question or a comment? Just raise your hand or chime in. You're muted, Kate, so I see your picture, but you're at a loss for words.
I'm just really a fly on the wall here.
Okay. All right. Well, I thought you might, now that you finally you've spoken with most of these people in getting their stories ready. So I know you've probably had some other questions answered. Rich, anything you've got on your mind?
Sure. First of all, thanks, David, and thanks, Kate and Sarah, for the good work of reinvigorating the Traver Award. It's what a privilege for me to meet you all, and thanks to every one of you who have submitted stories, contributed your knowledge tonight, and over time we want to pay this forward, because as Seth Norman said last week, either online or perhaps afterwards, this is an opportunity to bring young people to the fore, and people who need to go fly fishing as a way to step away from all of the craziness in this world right now and learn lessons on the water and listen to the water and the voice of the water. David, thank you for waking up, taking your time in the middle of your evening. I really appreciate it. I was fishing in Scotland and heard the fellow says, "Well, that fish takes the biscuit." Just wonderful times there. And tell us just a little bit more about the wildness of Ireland and the straight-laced part of England that was your fate.
Well, in the 60s in Ireland, the fishing was completely free and no one owned anything, and anyone would let you fish anywhere. So it was just unbelievable to us kids. And a whole gang of us used to roam around catching trout. We'd light a fire and wrap the trout in paper and put them in the fire and eat trout and come home with diarrhea. It was just wonderful. Whereas England was so, so straight-laced, and we couldn't afford the expensive angling clubs, which is, they run everything in England. There was no wild fishing, so it was just wonderful.
And where in Ireland did you fish?
Monaghan. My grandfather lived in Monaghan. My uncle in County Tyrone, and the lakes there. The little town he lived in is called Clonus, and there's 60 lakes around it, and most of them had never been fished. So you never knew what you were going to catch. It's just wonderful. And of course, sadly, it's changed a lot, for various reasons, which you just alluded to.
Well, let's open it up to other folks. If anybody else has a follow-up question, love to have you press these folks for maybe a few more of their insights or secrets.
So David, I noticed that somebody had asked a question in chat about the rewrite process.
Yeah.
Ken was asking, how do you approach the rewrite process? Or do you have an approach, or is it more organic? And I hope some of the other writers can talk about this too, but for me, I put it aside for a while and let it rest. And then I come back to it and I start asking myself questions like, is there anything here that isn't clear? Can I take this piece and put it over here and change the way the story is told? I also like to get, and I think that this came up on the last session, if I can get other people, particularly people who I know understand the writing process, to take a look at it. That was one of the things that was so great about the class I took, is I got some really good feedback, and people would ask, how did you feel when you were in this, when this one little part I was writing about, but I didn't really expand on what it felt like. So having someone else's eyes on the story to ask you those questions and kind of direct you to those pieces, to me, is very valuable in rewriting. I don't know that I have a process, but those are things I look for.
Anybody else have a comment on rewriting?
Yeah, I'm sorry, Mike, you can go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just gonna, I was gonna add that, I like Paige, just set it aside for a little while and try to come back to it. But I try to, I think it's sort of circular, but rewriting starts with good writing, with writing your first draft with abandon. The phrase, write drunk, edit sober. Write that first draft without any inhibitions or any worry about anything, and then come back and be a very sober editor and ask yourself, does this really work? Does this, should this stay? Should this move? Should this be expanded? And I think that if you write that first draft without any kind of inhibition and just write it, you don't feel quite so worried about cutting some of it and trimming it and taking a more aggressive red pen to that draft, because you just you put it on paper and then you can get back into the rewriting portion. So
question for Alex Benoît. You said that you try not to write directly about fly fishing, that when you do, it's limiting. Can you elaborate a little more on that? And I'm going to expand that to anybody as well, which should pick up on what Mike Chalmers was saying, is sometimes when you write that first drunk draft, you go back and you mine it for things that you want to expand on. You look for things like, what's in here that I didn't expect? Or what is this story really about? Because you don't always know that when you write it the first time. By the time you get to the end, you realize, oh, wait a minute, this story is really about humility, or it's really about something else. And Alex, let's let you have a first crack at that question.
Sure. Yeah. So I think that stems from exactly what you just said, that fishing, and it seems that it's not just for me, but for many of the panelists here, and I would imagine for many of you guys who are here as well, that it's never just about the actual fishing itself. There's many reasons we go fishing, certainly to fill some type of void, to connect with people, to connect with places. And for me, when I say that I try not to write directly about fishing, that stems more from the structural way that I tend to write, in just how I tend to approach a topic. I don't typically write narratives or pieces that just have a distinct beginning and end. The way that I tend to write is sort of like it's a style called a braided essay. If you're not familiar with that, just think of like braiding hair, right? Where you have either 2 or 3 separate stories or things that you're trying to connect, that you're sort of legitimately weaving in and out of. And for me, doing something like that helps you think about your topic in a new way. Like for me, the 3 things that I typically tend to write about are fishing, memory and then like places or landscapes. And so in blue lines, that looks like, fly fishing in Alaska, about both remembering what really was a phenomenal trip and a really really great opportunity to connect with my dad and my cousins a little bit more, but also that while I was remembering this place in a very distinct way, I was also witnessing my grandfather begin to, the earliest stages of dementia. And then obviously remembering just what it's like to be in Alaska, such a foreign landscape to someone who had grown up in New England for his whole life. So when I write, I'm not ever just writing about fishing. That's just my personal take on it. I think there are I can certainly tell plenty of fish stories about a particular fish, but it's about so much more than that to me. It's about, like the time that I had all my fishing gear stolen, and then my neighbor lent me his things just out of the kindness of his heart, and going and catching a single brook trout in a mountain stream that you had to crawl on your hands and knees to get to. That there's always a story behind the fish, and at least for me, rarely is that solely about fishing in itself.
Thank you. Couple others to add to that, and again, these are for anybody on the panelists, Mike, if you guys want to chime in here. One of the questions that came to me says, regarding the rewriting process, do the panelists have a certain amount of time that they hold as a goal for it to set aside? And do any of them read their stories out loud, or do any of you have fly anglers or other people read your stories for you? So there's a whole set of questions. The one about reading out loud, that's one that, when I was teaching freshman college students how to write better college essays, I tried to get them to at least keep their story overnight, or 2 nights, and read it out loud. Those are the 2 of the rules that I said. If you can do that, you'll go from a C to a B, just by keeping it overnight and reading it out loud. Those 2 things will bump your grade up at least a full letter grade without my even knowing you did it. So others have any other kind of self-imposed rules or techniques?
Yeah, I'll jump in there, David. I find that reading out loud is extremely important. If you like listening to the moth stories, say on NPR, that's a good way to get a sense of pace and timing and import. Actually, they've got a new book coming out just saying how to tell a good story, from the Moth team there. But telling a story out loud allows you to test drive it a little bit, not just in terms of the dialogue, but the pacing. And if you have an audience, whether it bores them to tears or not. The other part I think tucked in there was in revision, how do you know what to toss out? Well, the word limit can help, even if it's somewhat arbitrary. If I've got 1,500 words I got to trim it to, and I've started with 3,000, that really forces you to look carefully about what is absolutely necessary and what is fluff. And I find word limits quite useful in cutting down something to a better product and whittling it down to something more lean and impactful. So I think arbitrary word limit use can be a good way to limit verbosity and sort of silliness.
Anybody else?
I would encourage people, if you can find an opportunity like a local moth storytelling. I challenge myself to, I read the stories out loud because particularly I feel like that helps me find the flow of the words. But if you can take a story you've written and go tell it out loud at one of those storytelling nights, you're going to learn so much about a reader's reaction or an audience reaction to it. And you will also find that you craft the story in a certain way when you're going to tell it. And I actually base my whole business model is on the idea of storytelling, because I think that's what we're doing. All of us here who are writing, whatever we're writing, you're telling a story and you want people to connect with it. And anything you can do to find out how that works and what works, I think is valuable when you're writing. So yeah, go tell the story to, your roommate and see if it resonates. That will help you figure out what parts to keep in and what parts to take out.
Can I just add to what Paige said? I know I just spoke about this, but I think it would be wonderful to see some aspect of the Traver Society encourage, like through Zoom here, a platform where people share stories out loud, and we kind of talk about them and talk people up and give friendly criticism in a good way. I think that'd be really useful. Out here in the Pacific Northwest, Jason Rolfe, who's now the Fly Fish Journal editor, I think, had a series called Writers on the Fly. And it was fun. You go, you'd read a story or you'd hear some stories from all kinds of folks. And there's every reason why this could be even easier to do in this day of Zoom, whereas before it was geographically limited.
Yes. And, we got that comment last week of people looking for who can read your stories for you. And it occurred to me afterwards that the people who are on these two calls ought to become a writing group, or ought to find a way to create some writing groups amongst yourselves and swap your stories and push yourselves as writers. And if anybody's interested in that and they want to email me, I don't want to give out anybody's email address, but I have everybody's email address. But if people want to say, yes, I'm in, I would be happy to put you guys on some kind of a roster and send it out among you to reach out to each other, because I think that would be a great way to bump this level of skill up a few notches. So, to Michael's point as well, Michael Doherty's point, I think we said last week, one of the writing instructors that I followed had a saying that clarity is king, rhythm is duke. And my daughter was noticing in my writing that I use and a lot, but I do that sometimes when I want a sing-songy list rather than a comma list, because commas break things up in a way that is not as melodious as sometimes when you have and. It doesn't look right to an English teacher, but it may read correctly if you were reading it. If you're standing up in front of a group and reading it, you could make that sound more melodious than if you parse things out with commas. So sometimes that's the kind of thing that you hear in your head. Let's see, I got some more on here. Got some conversations going among the group here. Anybody else have any? I'm just trying to mine the chat, but if anybody else wants to just speak up, unmute yourself and raise your hand and give a shout.
Hey, David, one thing that happened on the last panel that I thought was really interesting is some of the writers mentioned other writers or authors that they admire and recommend reading. I'd love to hear that.
Sure. Yeah, I think Michael Doherty already reeled off his list pretty well, but Alex, David, or Mike, do you have any others that you like?
Toby had a call.
Yeah, I mean, I have quite a few. Three that I always turn to. Only one of them really writes about fishing frequently, and his name is Christopher Camuto. I'll write his name in the chat. I'll write all three of their names in the chat, but He's written books called Another Country, which is about the Smoky Mountains. He's written A Fly Fisherman's Blue Ridge, which is fishing in the Blue Ridge Mountains here. Another name is Ian Fraser. He's a pretty popular one. I really loved his book, Travels in Siberia. It's a really great way or he does a really nice job of talking about like a journey and landscapes and then individual stories and things like that. But what takes the cake for me is the late Tim Robinson. He was born English but lived on the Aran Islands in Ireland, and he wrote all about the Aran Islands. And for writing about places, I think there are few better than him. So I'll put those names in the chat in case anyone is interested in those.
David, I'd love to hear your list.
I've got a couple. I don't know if you can see that one. That's a good book. Very enjoyable.
Brian Clark. Can you type that into the chat as well if you get a chance?
Yeah.
Blood Knots.
Blood Knots. That's a very good one.
All right.
Two good ones.
I'm going to use this opportunity to make a plug for my book.
Yeah.
Which is all about writers. It's called Storied Waters, and this is how I found my way to the Volker inner circle and to Rich van der Veen's dinner table. But I took a trip a number of years ago where I tried to go to as many places as I could that are mentioned in fly fishing writing, and it was a 6-week trip, and it took me up to Marquette, Michigan, and back to fish in Frenchman's Pond, and that's kind of how I got the whole Traver Volker bug. But the book is full of, especially some of our forgotten writers. The people who wrote in the heyday of magazines in the 50s and 40s and 60s, people like Edmund Ware Smith or Corey Ford or Louise Dickinson Rich or Gordon McQuarrie. These were masters of the short stories who wrote month after month and had big followings. And some of their stories are just like, when I read Edmund Ware Smith, one of my favorite writers, his stories I read his paragraphs and I'm in awe of his paragraphs sometimes, which is what I call writing for craft, is reading for craft and trying to understand how he does what he does. Another one that are amazing are the Dud Dean stories, which are all written in the Maine vernacular, which kind of reminded me of David Clough's Irish dialogue. So yeah, there's some great writers, and if you want to look at Storied Waters, there's a whole bibliography in the back full of some of the best fly fishing and outdoor writers over the last 100 years. Anybody else?
I'll just put a quick plug in for to read everything. I'm a big believer that even the bad writing can teach you stuff. If you read something and you're like, this is terrible, ask yourself why it's terrible. What is it that the writer failed to do? What was it? Was it the structure? Was it the character? Was it overwrought? Was it too hard? It was too hard to understand. Was it not followed? If you can sort of dissect what's wrong, it'll help you in your own writing become better at what you're trying to do.
David, since you gave a plug for your book, which I certainly endorse, I think we should talk about Stephen's book. I guess if you can see it, A Cast in the Woods.
Yep.
Terrific story about his cabin in the woods, and fish on, fish off. I love them both, Stephen.
Thank you, Tom. I'll send you your $5 later.
Oh, it's 10. It's 10.
Oh, okay. That's right. 2 books. That's right. Thank you.
Stephen, do you have anything to add here? You obviously are somebody who, Stephen and I sat next to each other signing books one day, so that's how we got to know each other.
Yes. when I'm writing and I'm stuck on something like, how a fish took a fly or how a stream sounded, I go to Tom McGuane and I have a tattered dog-eared copy of The Longest Silence. And I just pick a passage and I read it and I go, oh, that's really good. And it's humbling how good he is, but it's inspiring too, because it makes you sort of want to up your own game on that. So that's what I do when I'm stuck. I go to great writers and I read how they did it. And then I try not to copy verbatim what they wrote, but I definitely find myself influenced by what they wrote. So I'm sure other people are probably guilty of this too. Or maybe it's just me.
Well, and I hope everybody has a copy of Trout Madness and Trout Magic, because those are fabulous stories, and our namesake here for this award spent a lot of time practicing his craft and has been a lot of inspiration for all of us. And some of his stories are pretty straight up. They seem like pretty straight up fishing stories, but if you read them a second time, you realize they're about something more than that.
Right.
And
David, one quick shameless plug for the Writing Award Financing Committee. we have 15 copies left of Trout Madness, signed by John Volker, Robert Traver. Before we convinced him at one point to sign 625 pages to say the Volker Foundation and the author gratefully acknowledge your contribution. And all but 15 or 20 of those have been $200 contributions to the foundation. But I'd like to also say that each of the writers that participated tonight, I will send them a copy if they'll send me their address.
Oh,
Thank you.
As a bonus for your participation, and thank you
nice.
all. But for those who haven't won the award yet, please submit your stories by May 31st. Please encourage others to enter. This is, like all things in life, this is 100% volunteer effort since 1989. No one's been paid a dime, but we've had a lot of fun with the Volker Foundation. And each of you are welcome to join us or participate or send a contribution and get a limited signed edition of John Volker's Trout Madness.
Yeah.
Pay it forward.
So we've got, yes. So a plug for the museum and for the Volker Foundation. You can go to the website for either of them. Encourage you to join the museum if you're not already a member. Their quarterly magazine is wonderful, but there's a number of other great programs that they offer. We also, and same thing with Volker Foundation. If you want to go there, you can become a member and make a donation to the Volker Foundation. Encourage you to go to the website there.
And one more last point, Kate and Sarah, Sam Pitcher and I talked the other day about a $100 contribution would be divided evenly between the museum and the foundation, dedicating it to the Writing Award going forward, so that we can actually endow it at some point. So when we walk on, it will continue to go.
So I think I'm trying to remember, the Volker Foundation is just volkerfoundation.com, right? It's pretty simple.
Correct. Yep.
Yeah. So if you want to go there.
Museum is amff.org.
.org, right. I will try to tally up some of the lists of writers. If the panelists want to send me some of their lists of writers, I'll try to make a list, and I can send it out to all the participants from the two shows if we get a full list of recommended writers. I know it's a long list, but if you've got some favorites, then we can share those. And pretty much all of you have gotten emails from me directly from my personal email, or you can go to traveraward@gmail.com. Both of those go to me. And if you want to try to reach out to other people for a writing group, then if there's some way we can facilitate that, see what we can do. We did mention last week, this is not a writing it's not a writing course, it's a contest. But we're just trying to hopefully reach out and inspire people to, we don't want to discourage people. As you heard here, many of these folks are not professional writers, or they do one type of writing and they've reached out in another area, or they've done this just through lots of practice. So I find that to be very encouraging, and I hope we'll get lots of entries by the 31st. You've got plenty of time to write, rewrite, and rewrite some more between now and May 31. I will also remind you, please be sure to follow the submission requirements that are on the Volcker Foundation website. I've been getting people not using the right file name convention. I had somebody who sent a story in that was over the 3,000 word limit. And many writing contests will just basically just disqualify you and throw you in the trash and not even tell you that that's what they did. I usually reach out to people and say, please fix your file, please send it as a PDF, please give it the right name. It just creates extra work for me when I'm trying to get the all of these out to the judges. So we will, if you can follow the submission requirements, it just makes my life a lot easier. Another quick question here: when are photos or illustrations added to an entry? We can ask Kate and Sarah can speak to this, but in the 3 years that I've been involved, after we have a winner, we talk to the winner about whether we can find an illustrator. It's a challenge with the time from when we choose a winner to when the magazine goes out. It's hard to have an illustrator do the work, but we've been lucky in years past to be able to find some excellent illustrators to submit work that goes with the story. And so we've done that after we announce the winner and before it goes to publication. So it is still a challenge.
David, quickly, I apologize to everyone. She who, as Rumpel of the Bailey would say, she who must be obeyed is ringing the dinner bell.
Okay.
So I need to withdraw, and I look forward to. I thank every one of you who joined in and participated tonight. Thanks a lot. Good night.
We are wrapping up. I'll stay on for a minute if anybody has another question or two, but thank you, folks, and appreciate your joining us. And thank you to the panelists. You guys did a great job. We really, there's my dog barking. So thank you very much. And we look forward to reading a lot of great stories this year.